Well, let me invite you to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 this morning. We have been working our way sequentially through this book, in particular this chapter, and in it Paul is explaining to his readers that there is a future physical, bodily resurrection for all Christians. It was not a new idea. Over the course of history, there have been many that have anticipated a future resurrection, a bodily resurrection. The Jews held the hope that one day there would be this coming resurrection. In John chapter 11, as Jesus is addressing Martha at the death of her brother Lazarus, Jesus said to Martha, "Your brother shall rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Whenever Paul addressed Felix at his trial, Paul said in the presence of all of the Pharisees who were there, "I serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked." As I was preparing for this message, I was kind of taken with how many different references there were to the resurrection. The Old Testament speaks of it in a couple of different places. Job chapter 19 and verses 25 and 26, Job says, "As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God." Isaiah 26 and verse 19, Isaiah writes, "Your dead will live, their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy. For your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits." The New Testament chronicles a resurrection as well. In John 6 and verse 44, Jesus said, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." Paul spoke of a coming resurrection in 2 Corinthians 5:2, where he said, "For indeed this house," speaking of his physical body, "for indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, shall not be found naked." The Bible speaks of a coming resurrection that will be universal for the righteous and the unrighteous. Daniel 12 and verse 2 says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." Acts 24 and verse 15, Paul said, "There shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked." Hebrews 9 and verse 27 says, "And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment." In John 5 and verse 28, Jesus said, "An hour is coming in which all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice and shall come forth. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment." The believers who were in Corinth had word of this, but the specific details about their resurrected bodies they did not know. But the resurrection of Jesus was a guarantee of the resurrection to come for all believers. In John 14 and verse number 19, Jesus said, "After a little while, the world will behold me no more, but you will behold me. Because I live, you shall live also." That's a lot of different quotes about the resurrection in the Bible. In fact, as I was going through that, I was amazed at all of the different ones that were there. And yet still people have questions about the resurrection. The primary question is, how is it going to happen? What's going to take place? What is that going to look like? I mean, if cemeteries are just sleeping places, what is all of that going to be about, and how is God going to do it? But there's another question, and that is that in all of the different situations to consider with how people died, what is that going to look like with their earthly bodies being resurrected? There's a lot of different questions without easy answers. What happens to the bodies of those who die violent, tragic deaths? those who are burned in fires, those who are dismembered in explosions, those who are crushed in accidents, how are their bodies going to be reassembled? What about those who die at sea and are eaten by sharks, or those who aren't buried in the wilderness and who are eaten by animals, and through the natural processes they become fertilizer for plants, and the plants grow, which are then in turn eaten by other animals? What's God going to do with all of that, right? What about those who are organ donors, who want to be able to donate their organs? Will that in any way stop God from reassembling our bodies and giving us a glorified body? And by the way, the answer is no. And what about those whose bodies have been used in the furtherance of medical science, who have wanted to donate their bodies to be useful, to be helpful in helping others? Will that in any way inhibit God from reassembling us? Again, the answer is no. And what about those who have been cremated and their ashes have been scattered in different parts of the world, scattered into the wind? How will God bring all of that back together? How will God resurrect those people, and what will their resurrected bodies be like? Those are just a few of the scenarios. I'm sure that you've thought of many. There's other questions, though, that come, and questions about older people. When older people die in old age, what will be the age of their resurrected body? In other words, will they be like we knew them last? Will they be older, or will they be younger? And if so, how young or how old? And that's a question that we don't know the answer to. And what about babies? Babies who have been lost at a very, very young age. How old will they be whenever they're resurrected? Will they be resurrected as babies, or will they come back as adults? And will we be able to recognize each other? How does all that work? And if that weren't enough, how can our resurrected bodies, which are subject to sickness and death and eventual decay, how can our bodies last forever? I mean, we know that they're not going to last forever here and now. We look in the mirror and we see the effects of Father Time and Mother Nature, and it's not pretty, right? We see that something has to change. Well, the Corinthian believers were having their own challenges with the subject of resurrection. The Greek philosophy of their culture said that the body was evil and that the spirit was good, and the body did nothing but imprison the spirit, and at death, finally, your good spirit was liberated from your evil body. And so as a result, death was welcomed. You were finally free. You were rid of this dead body. They had no use, no future use for a dead body. And the Corinthians had started to believe that. And so Paul was writing in order to correct this wrong doctrine, because it was encouraging immoral practices. They weren't believing there was a future resurrection. So that's what this chapter is all about. We pick it up here in verse number 35 and work our way down through verse number 49. And this is what Paul writes. But someone will say, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of a body do they come? You fool. That which you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body just as He wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of men, and another flesh of beasts, and another flesh of birds, and another of fish. There are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body. It is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man is from heaven. As is the earthy, so also are those who are earthy. And as is the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. And just as we have borne the image of the earthy, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. Now, Paul is doing something very specific here in this passage. He is noting three observations that will help his readers to understand the resurrection of the body. There were some in Corinth who did not believe in a resurrection of the body, and others who did, but they didn't understand it. And so what Paul writes here is helping his readers to get their arms around how a resurrection of their body will occur. There are two questions they seem to be asking, and he tells us that in verse number 35. He says, and he's talked about the necessity of believing in a personal, physical, bodily resurrection. And now he says there are some objections, two main questions. But someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of a body do they come? These questions are coming not from people who want to believe but are struggling to figure this out, but these questions are coming from those who did not believe in the resurrection at all. In fact, the people that were asking these questions were repulsed by the idea that a dead body would be raised. They saw no need for it. They saw it as repulsive. They saw it as unnecessary. Their body had been troubled enough while they were living, and to be raised from the dead, what use would anyone have for a rotting, stinking, decaying corpse? Well, some in the Corinthian church thought the idea of resurrection was ridiculous. And you say, wait a second, Scott, time out. How do you know that the people were asking those two questions? How do you know that they were coming from a heart of unbelief? Well, I don't know it from the questions themselves, but from Paul's response. Notice how he responds in verse 36. He says, you fool. The word means a senseless one who is ignorant, one who is not thinking soberly. And you think, why in the world would Paul rebuke someone for asking that type of a question? In other words, if I'm thinking about that, how is God going to raise the dead, and with what type of a body are they going to come? Am I foolish for thinking like that, for asking that? And the answer is no. It was the Spirit behind the questions that Paul is confronting. He knows those questions are not coming from someone who is looking for real answers, but from those who think they already know the answers. You see, the questions aren't questions to discover truth. The questions are given in order to mock Paul. They didn't think he had an answer. Okay, Paul, if the body's going to be resurrected, how is God going to raise a dead body from the ground, and what are those bodies going to look like? They were trying to push him into a corner. They were trying to trap Paul. They were trying to make him look like a failure. They were trying to harass him and discredit the apostle. They really didn't want to know the answer to this miracle and how it was going to take place. You know, the question that they were wrestling with was the question that each of us have to wrestle with. Do you believe in a literal, physical resurrection? In other words, whenever they put your body in the ground or whatever they do with your body after you die, do you personally believe that one day God will raise your body from the dead? And the question that is asked should be coming from a heart that really wants to believe. That wasn't the case with these people. They were coming from the heart of a skeptic, someone who was wanting to expose Paul as a fraud, as a failure. And so as a result, Paul says, you have a foolish heart whenever you ask those questions in that way. But he gives them an answer anyway. Paul begins to explain that the answer to their questions was right underneath their noses. And Paul begins to explain that the possibility of a resurrection from the dead is right there with something that they were very familiar, farming. Notice what he says in the latter part of verse 36. That which you sow In other words, that which you plant in the ground does not come to life. He's not talking about sowing with a needle and thread. He's talking about something that many of us are inexperienced, and that is planting a crop by planting seeds. That which you plant does not come to life unless it dies, and that which you sow or plant, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else. Now, the first observation that Paul is giving them that helps them understand the resurrection is this: life comes from death, seeds prove it. Life comes from death because seeds prove it. The Corinthians understood this very, very well. Many of them would have crops that they would tend. When they wanted a crop, they did so by sowing or by planting seeds. And they knew that those were dead seeds that they were placing in the ground. And the act of sowing was much like the act of burial. It was a hole that was dug and something dead was placed into the ground. And they knew that the seeds they were placing in the ground were not alive, and yet from those dead seeds would amazingly come living plants. Further, the plants that would spring forth from the dead seeds were nothing like the seeds that were planted. Normally, you can't tell anything about a plant from looking at the seed from which the plant came, unless you're familiar with them. In fact, if someone gave you a handful of different types of seeds, unless you are experienced with gardening or farming, you probably have no clue what type of a plant those seeds would grow. What Paul is saying here is that this is a perfect explanation of the resurrection. The resurrection occurs whenever a dead body is sown or planted in the ground, just like it occurs with a seed like a grain of wheat. In fact, Jesus used the very same illustration to refer to his own death and resurrection. In John 12 and verse 24, Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I'm saying to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Some were saying, "Come on, Paul, a body can't live again if it dies." And Paul and Jesus were saying, unless a seed dies, it cannot live. The point is that life comes from death. Seeds prove it. Now, the Corinthians knew the process for planting dead seeds very well. But how, Paul? How is it that a living body would come from a dead human body? Well, Paul explains it. Beginning in verse number 37, he says, "That which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else." Verse 38, "But God gives it a body just as He wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own." There's a missing ingredient here that you're not factoring in, Corinthians, and that is God's role in resurrection. Plants don't rise on their own, and neither do dead bodies. God gives them a body. In fact, it's in the present tense in the original. He continues to give. He will continue to give. In the same way God gives a new plant from a dead seed, so He give a new body to a dead saint. The resurrected body would in some ways be the same body that you had when you were previously alive, before you died, but not quite the same. It's going to be different. A body that God gives you. It's the body that God desires it to be. And listen to this. Each and every person is going to have their own special body that God gives. Now, if you didn't know any better, how would you ever guess that a living plant would come from a dead seed? If you didn't know anything about farming, if you somehow didn't know anything about where plants came from, how in the world would you ever figure out that by putting a dead seed into the ground, a living plant would come? There's just no way to intuitively know that is going to occur. But if you know that a dead seed can be planted in the ground and God somehow miraculously brings a living plant to life, why does it seem incredible that God could transform a dead body into a living one? Paul says, you don't believe this can happen? The principle happens all the time with farming. Just watch what you're doing. It's a perfect illustration of the resurrection that's going to come. And you say, well, wait a second, though. I've never seen a living body come out of the ground from a dead body. I've seen plants come from dead seeds, but never living bodies from dead bodies. No, we haven't seen that yet. But God tells us it's going to happen. The question is, do you believe it? Paul says, here's one way you can understand this. One observation is that life comes from death. Seeds prove it. Here's something else you can look at and you can understand it a little bit better. Bodies take distinct forms. Creation reveals it. In other words, there are different types of bodies in the world. Verse 39, all flesh is not the same flesh. There's one flesh of men and another flesh of beasts and another flesh of birds and another of fish. In other words, everything is different. We're not the same. We're not even the same as people, but we're in class the same. But when you get into the animal kingdom and whenever you get into the bird world and the fish world, there are all these different types of flesh, people and animals and birds and fish, and everything's different. Why? Because God made them that way. They're different because God made them. Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, God tells us that we're here, and so is the rest of His creation because He created it to be so. Paul says not only are there different types of people and animals and birds and fish, but verse 40, there are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. In other words, there are different realms in which these bodies function. And the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. God gives them all their unique bodies, and God gives them the realms in which these bodies will live. In fact, heavenly bodies differ in splendor and brilliance from the earthly. Verse 41, so there is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. You ever notice that? Wherever you look, you see the differences that God has made, the distinctions. And that's the point. God makes different bodies and He organizes them differently in order to serve His purposes. Are you aware of what's taking place around you? I mean, are you going through life with your eyes open, or are you watching the difference between the brilliant sun, something you can't even look at without damaging your eyes, and yet a moon that has a softer glow, and yet the brilliance is different and for a reason, but you're watching it come up at night? Are you looking around and seeing all of the things that are different? Fish, the way they are, and birds and animals and people, they're all different. And do you ever wonder why? It's not because that millions and millions and millions of years ago, a fish or some sort of a cell decided it wanted to grow and suddenly become a bird, and after millions of years of concentrating hard and wishing that it would, poof, suddenly it became a completely different animal. No, that's not what happened at all. It didn't evolve. God made them different. And here's the point that Paul is addressing here. Have you ever considered that the differences between earthly bodies, everything you see here on earth, and heavenly bodies is an illustration of the distinction between your physical earthly body and your resurrected body? In other words, in the same way that God makes everything different, He's going to make your resurrection body to be different from your physical body. Life comes from death. Seeds prove it. Bodies take distinct forms. Creation reveals it. And here's the third observation that he makes, and that is that bodies serve different purposes. Christ enables it. Your body serves a purpose, the purpose that Christ enables you to serve. He continues on in verse number 42, so also is the resurrection of the dead. Your future resurrected body, listen to this, will be different from your physical body here, just like the earthly and the heavenly bodies are radically different from one another. In other words, the body that God is going to give you in the future at the resurrection is going to be vastly different from the one that you have right now. And aren't you grateful for that? And he starts to give these 4 sets of contrast here to help us understand what our future resurrected body is going to be like. The first one is this, verse 42. He says, it's sown a perishable body. Now, whenever he talks about sowing again, he's talking about planting. And the situation or the circumstance is the death of your physical body. When you die physically, the idea is that your body will be sown or buried, a perishable body. It is raised an imperishable body. The word perishable means corruptible. It means something that is subject to decay. Part of the reasons for the relatively short shelf life is because of what your body is made of. In fact, I found one writer who said this: the constituent parts of a man would be equal to 1,200 eggs, iron enough to make 2 10-penny nails, phosphorus enough to make 4,000 matches, enough fat to make 75 candles or more, 1 cake of soap, enough hydrogen to fill, you caught that, didn't you? Enough hydrogen to fill a balloon, 60 spoonfuls of salt, a bowl of sugar, and 6 gallons of water. That's you. Charles Mayo of the Mayo Clinic says you have enough lime in your body to whitewash a chicken coop, enough magnesium to make a dose of magnesia, potassium enough to explode a toy cannon, and sulfur enough to rid a dog of fleas. That's encouraging, isn't it? That's what we're made of. And so we understand that our body is corruptible. Our body is perishable. Have you noticed how you have to maintain your body? Have you noticed everything that you have to do in order to keep it from deteriorating? I mean, the things that you put on the outside of your body, not to mention what goes on the inside. I mean, think about it. How much do we put on chapstick or lip balm? How much of hand lotion, deodorant? I mean, it just keeps on going as you're trying to preserve this, and hair detangler, right? I mean, some of us really spend a lot on that, right? But you've got all of this that you're doing in order to maintain this decaying body. And so most Greeks thought the idea of resurrection was impossible because our body is corrupt. Our body is perishable. The soul will last forever, they say, but this body breaks down. This body decays. Paul agrees the body will be buried and it is perishable. It is corruptible. But the body that will be resurrected is imperishable. In other words, the body that Jesus is going to give you in the resurrection will be without corruption. It is not subject to decay. Your future body is immortal. The idea here is about durability. The idea is how long your physical body will last, your resurrected body. Get this, the body that God will give you in the resurrection will never grow old. It will never get sick. It will never get wrinkled. It will never get tired. It will never sag. It will never lose, your skin will never lose elasticity. I mean, nothing like this will ever happen. You will never die. You will never decay. There will be no signs of nature at all. In fact, Father Time and Mother Nature will have no effect on you anymore. You will be youthful but mature. Someday you're going to be incorruptible. Someday your body will be imperishable. Your body will display God's wisdom in creating man or woman as the pinnacle of His creation. You will be a perfect example of God's goodness in His creation. You will have a body that will last forever. And you will represent the perfect form of humanity as God intended it to be. You, friend, will be perfect. It's about durability. It's also about value. Notice what he says in verse number 43. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. Your earthly body will be buried in dishonor, raised in glory. The word dishonor is speaking of it, death. The body is robbed of all dignity. It's imperfect. It's incomplete. The soul has been separated from the body. The Jews viewed a corpse as unclean. The corpse was considered contaminating. There was a rush to dispose of it. People avoided contact with the dead body. And oftentimes, you were buried the very day that you died. You don't have people digging up graves and stealing dead bodies because they have no value. That's the idea here. You're sown in dishonor, buried in dishonor, but your body is raised in glory. It's beautiful. Your resurrected body will be radiant. It's speaking of the value of your body in the future. It will be like the resurrected body of Jesus. It will have an honored position. It will have value. In fact, I found this to be fascinating. The word glory, where you see here in verse 43, it's raised in glory. That word glory is often used in the New Testament to describe the bright, shining radiance that surrounds the presence of God Himself. In other words, whenever we speak of the glory of God, it's either talking about the honor that God is given, or it's talking about this brightness that just emanates from Him. It's this shining forth. It's this Shekinah glory, this glow, if you will. And it surrounds Him. And this text seems to suggest, and I'm not dogmatic about it, but it seems to suggest, and others as well, that there is some form of that brightness or that radiance that will surround your resurrected body as well. In other words, it will mark your exalted position as someone that God has given to rule over His creation. And you say, well, where would you find that, Scott? Listen to Philippians 3 and verse 21. Paul writes that this one will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of His glory. Daniel 12 and verses 2 and 3. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. These to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Matthew 13 and verse 43, then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Some say the face of Moses that glowed when he came down from the mountaintop is in some ways a reflection of what we might have in our resurrection body. I don't know, but it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Your body will be beautiful, it will be glorious, it will be luminous, it will be valuable, like the body of Jesus at the Transfiguration. Jesus appearing to Saul on the road to Damascus was a bright light. Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration was blinding and shining forth. And the text seems to suggest that though our body is buried in dishonor, it's raised in glory or value. He goes on, it's sown in weakness. It is raised in power. Pertains to your ability. It's buried in weakness. In fact, it's the ultimate form of weakness. You're dead. You have no strength at all. You have no power whatsoever, but it's raised in power, raised in strength, raised in full vigor, full strength, full power. And you say, like, how much power, Scott? Like infinite power like God? And no, He's God and we're not. You say, well, how much power? Like superhero power? I mean, like, what are you talking about here? Are you talking like Captain American power? Are you talking about somebody else? Are you talking like Superman power? Are you talking like Incredible Hulk power? What are we talking about? I'm talking about we've probably watched too many Marvel comic movies is what I'm talking about, right? We've got too many points of comparison with that. I don't know. I do know that you're going to have full and complete power as God designed you to have. You don't have to go to the gym anymore. You don't have to watch what you eat. You don't have to do any more cardio. You don't have to do any of these things. You're going to have the full and complete power that God designed you to have in order to do what He wants you to do. It's incredible to think about it. Your abilities will be unrestricted because He will give you the body that you need to serve Him for all eternity. Verse 44 says it's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, then there is also a spiritual body. Commentators have gone back and forth on what this means, but it seems to pertain to where you're going to live. It seems to be the idea with everything he's setting forth. You've been buried as a natural body. You had a body that pertained to this earthly life, a body that was equipped for you to live in the here and now. But you're going to be raised a spiritual body. A body that is equipped to live in a spiritual world, a body that is equipped to live perfectly with God in heaven. It doesn't mean that you're going to be non-physical or ghost-like, but that you're going to be equipped to live a spiritual environment. In verse 45, he goes on to explain, "So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit." Paul reaches back to Genesis chapter 2 and verse number 7, and he reminds his readers again, there are two representative heads here. There's the first Adam with which all of us identify, and there is the last Adam, which is Jesus, which believers identify with. The first Adam, man, became the prototype for our earthly body. Our bodies are the way they are because God created Adam the way he created him. He became the prototype. He became the model for us to reflect in our physical body. The last Adam, Jesus, though, becomes the prototype for our resurrection body. In other words, our resurrected body will be like his. Every person who has been born received a physical body after the pattern of Adam's physical body, and every person who has been born again will receive a spiritual body after the pattern of Jesus' resurrected body. Verse 46, "However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual." Adam came first, Paul says, and then Christ. Verse 47, "The first man is from the earth, earthy." And it's interesting in the original, there's no definite article there. The first man is from earth. He's out of the ground. And it stresses that he's from the earth. And then the word earthy means dusty. It's a completely different word. The first man is from the ground, he's dusty, and it stresses his mortality due to where he comes from. The first man is from earth, he's dusty, he's not going to last. But the second man is from heaven, meaning that he's going to last. "As is the earthy," verse 48, "so also are those who are earthy. And as is the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. And just as we have borne the image of the earthy, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly." Christian, listen, you will have a resurrected body like that of Jesus. It's a physical body. He's not a ghost. His disciples could touch him. He had flesh and bones. He could eat food. He could travel where he wanted to. He could appear one place. He could appear another. He could pass through walls. You say, what is all that about? I don't know, but it sounds fun, doesn't it? And yet his resurrected body was somewhat like his physical body, but it was different. And Paul is just explaining what this is going to be like. God will raise, listen to me, God will raise your mortal body from the grave just like he raised Jesus from the grave. And even though you don't fully understand what your body will be like, it's special. Paul took a long time in order to help them understand what God was going to do in the future. Jesus is going to enable you to have a body that will be perfectly equipped to live in his presence. This is amazing to think about. Not only is your soul redeemed, but so will your body be redeemed. You're going to be able to live in his presence forever. This thing that you keep trying to maintain, this tent that gets older, you're going to get a new one. And your body will have all the perfect qualities that God created you to have. Sin will no longer have an effect on your resurrected body. You will be living proof of God's wisdom and his goodness that is demonstrated through his creation. Your resurrected body will be an example of perfection. Now, the question that comes down to is, are you identified with Christ? In order to have this body in the future, you've got to be identified with Him, right? We're all connected to Adam. We all know Adam as our father, Adam as our first head, right? But not everybody is connected to Jesus. You say, well, how does that happen? If I don't know, how does that occur? The good news is that you don't have to do anything. God's already provided the way whereby you can be united to Christ. You can become a believer. All that remains is for you to respond in repentance or turning away from the life lived for yourself and trusting in what Jesus did on the cross for you. God says that if you're willing to do that, all your sins will be forgiven and your future changes for all eternity. It's great. John wrote about it in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2 when he wrote, "When He is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is." Brothers and sisters, I hope that's an encouragement to your heart this morning. It gets a little bit hard the further along you get, but you know what? Good things are coming. We have an opportunity to remember that the reason we're different is not because of anything we've done, but because of what God has done for us in Christ. I want to invite the men to come as they prepare to serve us at the table, and our musicians to come as well. As they're coming, I ask that you take just a moment where you are to just prepare your heart for the Lord's table. Maybe if there's some unconfessed sin in your heart, that you would, just in the quietness of your seat, deal with that. Something that's not right that you've been holding on to. Will you just turn away from that and let that go? And just prepare your heart for the table. If you're not a believer, this is just a time to watch. But if you're a Christian with a heart that is right toward God, the table will be open to you. Lord, how our hearts are encouraged this morning to read these words from Paul. Especially the further along in life we get, to know that there are such good things that you have for us in the future. We have so much to be grateful for in the here and now, even if a future resurrected body wasn't part of the plan. How merciful and gracious you've been to change us from the inside out through the death and burial and resurrection of your Son. Lord Jesus, we want to thank you for your perfect obedience to the Heavenly Father, and for the salvation that you have so graciously secured for us. Everything is different because of you. God, I pray that as we partake of the bread and the cup this morning, that our hearts would be reminded that we're different because of what Christ has done for us. Lord, may you bless our time together this morning as we remember your death. In your name we ask it. Amen.